Hello, my name is Ben Charland. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. On this week's show, I've got a friend of mine in Calgary, Eric Peters, who talks to me about a book by Edward Luce written last year called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Now, this book really strikes at the heart of what's going on in the world today with the sort of crisis of liberalism that we talk about almost incessantly on this show. But the best way that I'm going to frame this quite insightful yet also quite chilling book is to quote that book itself. Here goes. Western liberal democracy is not yet dead, but it is far closer to collapse than we may wish to believe. It is facing its gravest challenge since the Second World War. This time, however, we have conjured up the enemy from within. We have put arsonists in charge of the fire brigade. Now, before we get to that, I wanted to ask you a favor. If you like this show, please spread the word. Social media or word of mouth, however you want to do it, and the best way is to go to the website, woegoshow.com. That's wogoshow.com, and on there you can find links to social media. You can find my email address where you can send me your suggestions for future episodes and future guests. But please spread the word, give other people that website, tell them about the show, and if you can, give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. So without further ado, here's my conversation this week. Okay, I'm here with Eric Peters. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about The Retreat of Western Liberalism by Edward Luce. I believe I'm saying that right. I had to look it up at a YouTube video, how to pronounce this guy's name. So the show always starts with the same question. We're going to do it the same thing with this book. We both read this book. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed it. And I think that even though it was from about a year ago that it was published, I think it's still very, very both prescient and hitting the nail on the head with what's going on right now.
I found it very interesting in that it almost looked, again, thinking about it, that it was written a year ago, that it was almost prophetic and kind of was seeing down the track before anybody else did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Edward Luce has done a bunch of, obviously, speeches and panels that are on YouTube, and I've watched a couple of them, and a lot of them are from only a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And what is clear is that he says it's gotten both better and worse in what his diagnosis of the problem is. It's gotten better in the sense that, I mean, we're going to get into this, but better in the sense that people are more aware than he expected they would be, more apt to read things, more apt to accept what's true. But it's gotten worse because this is no longer an Anglo-American dilemma. Right. It's a global dilemma. And that was some of the people when the book was first published said, this is clearly the retreat of Anglo-American liberalism. Right. But with what's happened in Italy, what happened in Germany with the election back, I think, in September, this is clearly a global or at least Western problem, truly. Which
Definitely
makes him,
Western.
Right,
Definitely
which makes him even more prophetic. Anyway, so the first question is always, what on earth is going on? So, Eric, according to The Retreat of Western Liberalism, what on earth is going on?
So, reading the book, there was one quote that really, really stood out to me. And I would read a couple of chapters or read ahead a little bit, and then always come back to that quote. And that quote is, when people lose faith in the future, they are less likely to invest in the present. And Edward Luce, while he's going through the book, and he separates the book into four pieces, the thread that really ties them together, I think, is that. And going even further into that quote and to some of the things that the author was saying, it really was one of two things, or maybe both. One, that the promise of progress for the common person hasn't been fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And that our values aren't, there is an erosion of our values, especially in community, especially in whether or not we are here to help one another continue along with the project of, in this case, Western civilization.
Right.
and that because of the way I saw it was because there was that erosion of values, more so community values, and valuing community, and that, and we'll talk about the economic side of things and how that's really impacted people, but seeing the retreat into the individual, and I think that's really something that underscores and underlines, for me at least, the retreat of Western liberalism.
So the retreat into myself and away from community.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. I think one of the strengths with liberalism has always been that strong individuals create strong communities. And we took it for granted that strong communities also create strong individuals.
Right.
And that there's a cycle, that there is a benefit for both. That if you do have strong communities, and that could be any community, whether it's geographical or demographic, or that even if somebody wasn't as strong, they could be made stronger through, not for lack of a better word, the collective.
Right.
And we see, at least anecdotally, and with some of the great examples from the book, that there has definitely been a retreat into the individual, and specifically with the titans of industry who have disconnected themselves from the community, inserted themselves into a new community of, say, the global elites. I don't want to sound too tinfoily, too tinfoil hat, but their promises to a different group of folks, of their compatriots, right? And I'm sure, as we'll touch base and talk about further on, that folks are being left behind,
right?
And they are retreating not into the safety of community, but into the perceived safety of themselves.
Right, and there are forces at play that Edward Luce doesn't even talk about in the book. For example, technology and the fact that my cell phone or my computer, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, allows me to retreat further into myself as an individual, away from community, even when it seems like I'm engaging in a community, but it's often a false one. Exactly. And it's one that's based on upping the ante for marketing and making me like as much as I can and making me eventually consume.
Exactly.
But one thing that, and that's a great point, because I found a quote here that I thought was really telling for what you're talking about, this retreat into individualism, even as individual rights are at risk of being eroded, which is a fascinating sort of paradox here. And this is the quote from the book. He says, "Sometime during the 1960s, the Western left abandoned the politics of solidarity to embrace one of personal liberation. The corollary to that, of course, is identity politics. And now the left, not just in Canada or the United States, but in Europe as well, in the Western world, the left is trapped in this focus on identity politics. Many people would love to get out of it, to talk about jobs, to talk about automation, to talk about a universal basic income, to really try to grapple with the problems that we're presented with. But there's this feeling that we need to talk about groups of people who are feeling oppressed, which is absolutely important and is part of this community that you're talking about. But it seems like, and I believe Stephen Bannon actually said this, and he was the counselor to the president for, what was it, a year, maybe even
about
less.
That. Yep.
And he said that so long as the Democrats focus all of their attention on identity politics, if we go with nationalism, we win, hands down, every time.
Right.
And that's a paraphrase of the quote, obviously, but that's their game, that's their strategy, because they know that identity politics, in the end, feels to people unfair, even if we know from an elite liberal perspective that is the right thing to do.
Right.
And so it's not just about our societies, it's about our politics being eroded and losing the focus on what matters to people, and allow someone like Donald Trump to come in, obviously, and say everything is unfair. Immigration, for example, looks unfair. So therefore it is unfair. Let's overturn it. Let's stop it completely.
Right. So there are a couple things in what you said. For me, identity politics isn't so bad. I think when you play the game of identity politics, what makes it successful or not is whether or not you're picking the right group to identify with. So what do I mean by that? I mean, folks on the right are also playing identity politics.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. So it's amazing that, you know, when you hear conversations about identity politics, it's always a claim that's thrown at the left and as something bad. However, you know, and I think this just happened yesterday, the president of the United States held a rally and looked at everybody and said, "We are the super elites."
Yeah.
Well, who are we? You know, who attends those rallies? Who is the typical Trump voter? And I'm not talking about bigotry or racism or sexism or anything like that. It's a value. Like, there is a value that ties those people together, and that is their identity. And what he's speaking to is their identity. So, what you also said, in terms of both what Steve Bannon said and what Edward Luce said, is the Democrats are picking, or the left in general, they're picking the wrong group. They're picking the wrong groups. You know, it's absolutely understandable why, you know, you may look at LGBT or people of color or women and try to divvy them up into groups.
Right.
The problem with that, and I think Edward Luce said this in his book as well, is that the problem with that is you make some really, really interesting assumptions that because somebody is, you know, white, they're going to vote this way. So does that mean that you abandon them in search of people of color who will all vote this way? But we know that's not true. And it comes down to, and you're right, it is fundamentally unfair. It feels unfair.
Right.
How could it not? You know, how could it not feel unfair to, you know, a poor white West Virginian or a poor rural white Albertan when your government or, you know, the ideas of the day seem to center around poor people of color?
Right.
What makes their issue, their economic anxiety, more important than that of the rural Albertan, right? As an example.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, there is some fundamentally unfairness in that perception.
There's, I think it was, and I believe I mentioned this on a previous episode, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I think it was Barack Obama's, one of his economic advisors was interviewed, I think it was by The Economist Radio, and he was asked about globalization, and he said something that was quite pithy, but I also think was quite on the mark, which is that globalization, which is part of the that, according to Luce, is one of the major reasons why this is happening. An integrated global economy with the rise of China that brings the relative GDP of the United States down in regards to the rest of the world, and it increases this anxiety. What he said is that globalization, international trade, has diffuse benefits, but concentrated harms. But even if the benefits outweigh the harms are still felt more viscerally, more clearly, and have probably a much stronger political power if you want to use them. So, for example, this is from a conversation between David Frum, who wrote a book called Trumpocracy, and Edward Luce, and I think it's from about a year ago. And they talked about how there's only about 75,000 steel workers in the United States and 70,000 coal workers in the United States. A lot of these guys have postgraduate degrees because they're not working in the mines. These guys are running the business. That's 150,000 people out of 321 million people. It's tiny, but those stories have an incredible effect on people because the United States, an American, identifies with the steel worker, the coal worker.
Right.
That's our bread and butter. That's what built this country. I'm still in the 1950s where maybe millions of people in West Virginia, Missouri worked in coal and steel, and Indiana and Illinois. That was what built this country. It's diminished. It's diminished in part because of international trade, but of course also because of automation, which is only going to get worse. Donald Trump has no solution, nor do any of the people who are attacking Western liberalism. They have no solution to automation. unless they're going to become Luddites.
Right.
But what Luce is saying is one other thing that I wanted to point out to get your reaction to, which is that government has become technocratic. It's become distant and it seems far away. And a lot of people describe it as managerial. So the choice in a democracy is really between two of the same kind of things, apples and apples. And of course, Donald Trump, the orange, comes in and upsets everything.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you have a new choice. You have something that feels fundamentally different. Right. And even if I don't agree with it, well, screw it, because I've been voting for apples for so long. And this managerial sense of, I think actually Luce called it interest group management. That's what politics has become.
Right.
The sort of the end game of pluralism.
Right.
That all you're doing is managing different interest groups and forgetting the core, the community that we all fit into.
Right. And you know what? I would agree with you. But I don't know if I would say that government, and I really want to put the difference, I want to really make sure that we understand the difference between a political party in governance and government.
Okay.
Right. I really want to make sure that the differences are subtle, but they are large when we talk about, what they do. So interest groups, managing interest groups, absolutely. You look at governments that, the political party wing of the government, absolutely, 100%. You look at some of the administration and what I don't like calling folks this, but the bureaucrats, they're technocratic, but they are looking at utilitarianism. They are still very much what is the greatest benefit for the greatest amount of people. That still remains in the core of some of the work that they do, at least on the policy side. Now, whether or not the theories that they implement into their policy is actually in touch with what's happening in the public at large, we can have that conversation. I'm sure at some point you probably will. But taking something that you said, something different. When we look at what happened here in Canada with the Harper to Trudeau switch, or even more interestingly in the States, the Obama to Donald Trump switch. There are a lot of people who voted for the other guy who switched to vote for the new guy.
And if they didn't, it wouldn't have happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happened? And going back to your first question, of the podcast, it's really, to me, that progress hasn't fulfilled its promise. So just, I think, so Daniel Bell said, economic growth has become the secular religion of advancing industrial societies. And anecdotally, we all see money around us. We can feel it. But we also know, and there are people who, through their actions politically, have shown us all, whether it's in Canada or the States or Brexit in the UK or what's happening in Italy or the new government in Hungary, that there's something happening. And so what is it? We look at it and there are some things empirically that we can say, okay, there is a trend towards something. There's been an increase in suicide.
Right.
The decrease in life expectancy, particularly in the U.S., the decrease in social mobility, where America used to be the third, now it's now I think it's probably last amongst the OECD countries, and maybe not the OECD, but maybe the G7 or so.
Right.
Whereas, I think there was an article maybe a year or two ago where the headline read, "The American Dream's moved north." Right, to Canada.
Right.
And in places like the UK, again, that had said it was a classless society years ago.
Yeah.
They have a higher rate of social mobility than the United States. So when we think about what's happening, we can see that that there is definitely a change, and that with globalization in particular, which I think is probably the largest kick in the knees to the promise that yes, automation has done a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've also seen is that wages are being depressed here
Mm-hmm.
on the North American continent, at the very least, and replaced with much cheaper labor
Right.
in the East, in the Eastern Hemisphere. And people feel that.
Right.
When folks know, since, the 2008 downturn, wages haven't increased for folks. Most folks, at least in North America, haven't seen the same wages return
Mm-hmm.
at the point to the 2008 levels.
Right.
They haven't.
Yeah.
Like, there's a recovery for who?
Yeah.
But you can look at the Dow Jones and see that it's going up and up and up.
Right.
To the point where now, General Electric is now off of the Dow Jones and replaced with Walgreens. Well, what does that really show us? It shows that high, you keep the prices low, and in order to do that, you need cheap labor.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Edward Luce does bring this up, where he speaks about losing my train of thought here. But where he talks about folks are seeing that the wages of countries in the East, they're rising.
Right.
And at the same time, wages here are falling. And
Yeah.
they may not know that explicitly, but they can feel it.
That's the story that's clearly being told.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's impossible to actually argue with that story, because wages in North America are stagnating, but maybe worse, inequality is growing.
Right.
And that's undeniable. That's been told in so many different ways by so many different people since the Great Recession of 10 years ago, that it's really impossible to deny that inequality is growing. And if you look at history, that inequality poses a serious threat to Western liberalism. I think
Right.
Luce talks a lot about inequality in his book. But one thing that he says, I think it's one of the first thing he says in the book, is that the question that I'm trying to ask in this book is, and I've actually written it down, it says, is hostility to Western notions of progress wrong? Hostility from within, and obviously hostility from without as well. So hostility on the part of China, on Russia, Turkey, the Philippines, or at least the leaders of these countries are hostile to this Western idea of progress. So, is the idea or the story of progress broken? And that's what people are reacting to. But we also know that underneath that, there are real statistical evidence that this is happening. That there is stagnation in the West, and that there is incredible growth that continues in countries like India and China. Now, many have said, okay, that's the way that our world is going to look. I mean, what are we going to do? Hold things to the status quo artificially? That's impossible. And not only impossible, probably going to lead to war at some point. And so what we're talking about is the sort of the groundswell of both real threats and perceived threats, if there really is a difference between the two things, to, again, Western liberalism and the way that we conceive of our world. And I think that may be a segue into talking about the rules-based order of the West, right? And the international system that's been in place now for 73 years, that started at the end of the Second World War, United Nations, WTO, IMF, World Bank, this system that's been in place that is under attack, obviously from countries that would love for it to fail, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in China,
Right.
but now from within as well, from people like Donald Trump or those who voted for Brexit. And these forces aren't going away. The new populist government in Italy, who have said they don't want to sign the CETA, the
Right.
Canadian-European Union Free Trade Agreement. That there is a sense that your idea, your elitist liberal idea of progress is broken. We need to come up with a new one.
Right.
Whether that's to be as Stephen Bannon, to bring him up again as he wants, just outright conflict with China and shut them down, or we just have to reinvigorate our societies, maybe have illiberal democracy, as Viktor Orban in Hungary wants.
Has bragged about.
Right, and calls himself that, even though I think it was Fareed Zakaria who actually coined the term illiberal democracy. So what do you think about what Luce says about this international order?
So I think that for a very, very long time, I put my I put my tongue firmly in my cheek to say that the others of the world have looked at Western civilization as having put the boot on their necks for a very long time, and have actually held a disdain towards the way that the world, or that the United States has seen, and Western society in general has seen much of the world, especially from the changing capitals of London and Washington. And I'll give you an example. So, there was a quote. I don't remember who was saying it, but they were talking about China setting up or providing loans to folks in Latin America. And I think it was a senator who said, China is setting up on our back door. Like, that's a very interesting way to see the world when you literally have bases surrounding the planet, right? And again, it's very anecdotal, but there are reasons why, folks chant death to America, and why, people across the world love the ideals of the United States and Western countries, individualism, progress, prosperity, peace, democracy. But on the ground, that isn't the reality of the situation for those people. So that was a quote that I found very, very, very interesting. And there is a hostility to the Western or to progress, because from the view of the others, that Western progress has always come at their expense, right? In order, from the Opium Wars to, and I think Luce had some really good points in terms of technology, in Western technology, allowing them to really go forth and conquer the world.
Well, one of the key factors of the age of divergence, right? So, and this is what Luce talks about, that the age of when the colonialism began in earnest obviously in the 15th century, but of course in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, when it obviously started really in earnest, that the world diverged.
Right.
That there was a technological powerhouse in Europe and everyone else was left behind. And in fact, they were even put further behind because they were being taken advantage of, whether it was in Africa, Latin America, or of course in China with the Opium Wars in the 19th century. And you have this diverging world. And now we have the age of convergence, when everything is coming back together, when there is the conflict of these worldviews and these economies being essentially forced together. And there's no question that not only the economies are being forced together, but cultures are therefore being forced together as well. But I think it begs the question, and I hate to put you on the spot, but what do you think of that question? Is hostility towards Western notions of progress wrong?
I guess wrong in the sense that, we shouldn't have that hostility, or...
I don't know. This is Luce's question. He says, is hostility to Western notions of progress wrong? Whether it's within or without?
Well, I would say ultimately, it has to be, right? Because from where I sit, progress is supposed to mean the prosperity of as many people as possible. Right? If not all of us, if I can be absolutely idealistic.
And by people, you mean everyone on the planet.
Everyone on the planet. Yeah. We have finite resources, and we say that life matters, then yes, it should be that the Western idea of progress, of unlimited growth, of perpetuating climate change and not doing anything about it, so we can have better trinkets and nicer cars while folks starve across the world. It's immoral. And if that is what is seen as progress, that is wrong, and there should be hostility against it. Now, is that to say that there haven't been some things that have benefited a lot of people because of the progress? There have been some good things. But I wonder how much of that was also an acknowledgement that, yes, I may be okay, but the system or the progress that we're seeing is creating all of these other deficiencies in our community. You know, and when I think about things like both it happened all over the world. And I think Edward Luce made a really good point about it when he was talking about the 2008 quote unquote global recession. He made it clear that in fact
actually global.
It wasn't a global recession. It was actually a mid-Atlantic recession.
Right.
India's economy grew. China's economy grew to the point where they had to kind of slow it down a little bit just so that they could be sustainable. But it was devastating in the Western world. But the reactions of some governments was very interesting. So in the States, Barack Obama, a Democrat, you know, bailed out banks that are too big to fail, which ironically now are much bigger than they were then.
Yeah.
In Canada, you had a conservative government who kind of betrayed their ideologies, much like Barack Obama and the Democrats did in the States, and added, you know, a quarter of the nation's debt in order to do what? To bail out banks.
Yeah.
The same folks who caused the issue. And so, you know, going back to, you know, a few moments ago when we were talking about, you know, governments and how they manage, you know, when it's the political party governing, they clearly are involved in interest management because that's a very clear, that is a benefit that's very clear. You know, we can make the argument that, well, it was for the, you know, we had to maintain the system, but that money could have went to the people who are actually suffering the harm caused by the banks.
Right.
That wasn't even a conversation that was being had.
Sure.
Like, we have to bail out these banks and insurance companies because they're too big to fail.
Well, and this isn't this kind of the crux of the issue, because the Tea Party started at this time because you're bailing out the banks, you're doing nothing for Main Street in the United States, but it feels fundamentally unfair. It feels like, why are CEOs who are getting millions of dollars in bonuses and openly saying, and I don't know if Luce actually, it might have been this book or a different one, where Luce actually says and quotes one of these CEOs and says, hey, like, how could you possibly let your company go down in flames and yet accept like a $50 million package and from the government and be okay with that? And he essentially says, well, I'm the one game in the system and I'm benefiting from it. If you're not smart enough to do that,
right,
well, screw you.
Right.
And that, of course, feels unfair. There's a moral issue here.
Absolutely.
And I think what Luce says in several points in the book is that governments, political parties who are leading governments, retreated from moral issues, retreated from morality. So we're going to do something that feels and obviously is immoral in many ways. We're going to bail out these banks because if we believe in the greatest good for the greatest number of people, if we're utilitarian, well, then you're going to have to suffer through this. But in the end, it'll all be better because we believe, we have faith in the liberal democratic order.
Right.
Which is what, and he actually says this in the book. He says that is this just faith that we have? Is there actually evidence to support the maintenance of this liberal democratic order? And this is his question. Are Western notions of progress, or is hostility to Western notions of progress wrong? And what he's trying to say, I think, is it wrong to criticize these decisions like bailing out the banks because we're not seeing the long game? It may be immoral, but we're not seeing that really this is going to be good for everybody, because the Western notion of progress is indeed for everybody. Capitalism may be bound by national borders, but it will eventually move past them. But of course, this was the idea in the late 19th century in Europe, that if all these economies are connected economically, they would never go to war. And then look, of course, what happened.
Yep.
But it happened at a time when they were starting to pull away from each other.
Right.
Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that the crux of the issue is that governments or political parties or the elite or whatever we want to call them pulled back from the moral issues because maybe of a religious faith in this liberal order. But then the question is, if the idea of progress is indeed for everybody, because capitalists in the United States would absolutely tell you that, or capitalists anywhere, not just in the United States, would tell you that eventually people in Zimbabwe are going to benefit from this.
Right.
At some point down the line, there's going to be troughs and peaks and valleys and mountains, but one day we're all going to be good.
Right.
That's the Western notion of progress. It's actually an idea that is not nationalistic. It's international.
Right.
But I think what people are saying is BS.
Right.
It doesn't look like this at all.
Exactly. And that's, not to sound like a broken record, but, progress has broken its promise to us.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I remember when computers were just coming out.
Yeah, of course.
And, the one thing that we were told is this is going to be revolutionary. We're going to, one, live in a paperless world, and two, this will allow you to work less. You won't work as much with the computer.
Right.
It certainly doesn't feel that way anecdotally. And, you throw a mobile phone in my hands, now I'm not disconnected. And businesses can get, they can take every ounce of juice of productivity out of their employees, like to the point where we're going, I think France has done it. I'm not sure if other places have done it where, it's now against the law for an employer
to check their email,
to check
outside of work hours.
Outside of work hours. Right. And I mean, those type of things, we're tinkering with much bigger issues. We're tinkering with people's feelings, saying, look, the gains that, at least in Western society, that we've had, we know they're eroding. Unions used to be huge. Mm-hmm. Labor versus capital used to be a battle that folks could understand. Weekends, child labor, those things were addressed with the unions. Unions helped people read. Unions were one of the most important parts of women's suffrage, right? There was a lot that they did, but there's been a steady, I don't know, and whether it's a retreat by or an assault on unions, they don't have the same robust inclusion in society as they once did. Mm-hmm. Now they manage funds and try to ensure that their pension funds.
They become technocratic as well.
Exactly.
They're no longer fighting for the moral issues that their workers care about.
Exactly. And maybe that's the connection. Maybe, progress hasn't fulfilled its promise because at a point where it should, we no longer question the morality of what progress looks like. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Because now it seems to me, and to Edward Luce to some degree, that progress is something that those who can afford access to markets gets, while everybody else gets the crumbs.
Yeah.
Right? And I think people feel that, and one of my favorite quotes, I just, every time he mentioned a corporation, I thought of it more and more and more, by Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, it's socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people feel that, and I think there is a lot of angst, to the point. And I think the example of a Donald Trump and a Bernie Sanders, where they almost had the same economic message, in terms of we are being screwed. Yeah. We are being, they both didn't agree on TPP. They both agreed that there was an assault on the American worker. They both agreed that we had to do better for the people, right? They both agreed on healthcare, right? Like there were some things that were, that their styles were very different, and the places where they came from to come to those conclusions were very different.
Yeah.
But they both picked up on the pain points of people, and the people ultimately saying, we live in the richest society in the history of the world. You've seen it. We've seen it in Brexit. We've seen it. We live in the richest society, civilization in the history of the world, but it doesn't feel that way. I'm doing my part, but I don't see the value in continuing to do it. Right? And we can take that thinking even about the local situation here, and I think it's something that happens in every province and probably state, where teachers are now they're buying supplies for their students.
Yeah.
You can go to the Staples here and get a teacher's discount.
Right.
On the flip side of that, schools like, there are very wealthy private schools in this city and cities all across the world where they get public funding, mind you, that is taken out of the public school system, that sits in their coffers while they have tens of millions of dollars to build schools and auditoriums and add-ons. And when people hear this and see this, I have to pay for a supervisor to look at my children in school, look after my children during lunch. I've got to pay for school supplies. I've got to pay these, what's amazing to me, outrageous taxes.
Yeah.
But it's not that the taxes are outrageous. It's that they're seeing what is being done with their taxes, and compounded on that, they don't see the value in it.
Right.
They see the rich getting richer and the poor being where they are. And very interesting article that I was reading, that said that capitalism works. And over the last 30 or 40 years, or I think 30 years, that, because of capitalism, we've raised X amount of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that, this is the best that people have been in a long time. The article went on to say that if you removed China from that, the world actually got poorer.
Right. Interesting.
Right? So, and it's fascinating because that message doesn't sell.
Of course not.
That message would not sell. And so, I think that this book was very eye-opening, especially with some of my political leanings.
Yeah.
That, because he doesn't strike me as a leftist. He I would say he's quite firmly centrist, kind of, let's look at the numbers, maybe even certain, at some points, maybe even a little center-right.
Like old-fashioned center-right.
Old-fashioned center-right, and, but a lot of the economic threads that he connected made a lot of sense. And quite frankly, if you speak with somebody who has different political leanings than you, but works in a similar, say, socioeconomic bracket, you have the same issues.
Yeah.
You see the same unfairness. You feel life getting harder.
Right.
And that's always something that's very interesting, but it's how do we get there? And what do we do to make it better, right? It's
I'm glad you brought up, there's so many things in what you just said that I want to react to. I'm glad you brought up, first of all, trying to identify where Edward Luce is on the political spectrum, which is harder and harder to do because politics have become, they're being exploded as we speak.
Right.
So the old left and right paradigm is shifting. A lot of people are saying that the new paradigm is closed versus open, right? That the new paradigm is about the open society that is the hallmark of the international global liberal order,
right,
versus closing down, cutting down immigration, building walls, and doing everything in a zero-sum, self-interested game.
Right.
Another thing that you mentioned was, of course, that great quote by Martin Luther King, and he's speaking in the 1960s.
Right.
Look at how much things have changed and become. That was probably the most equal our species has ever been since the Industrial Revolution, or before that, maybe even since the Agricultural Revolution, where I think it was called the age of the Great Compression, where wages went up for those who were poor, and of course earnings from wealth went down because there was a 90% tax on people with a certain income.
Exactly.
And
corporations as well. Right.
And so you had this great compression, which was undone in the 1970s and 80s by Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. We all know the story. But we know, because the evidence is there, we know because that's the story that's clearly being told, that since Martin Luther King said that, it's become so much more prevalent. And I remember Naomi Klein said, it was during the Iraq War era, so she used a terminology that may not be as I guess, is apt anymore. But she said that what's happening is that the global elites, those who can afford it, are putting themselves into global green zones.
Absolutely.
So in Baghdad, of course, there was the green zone that was completely protected. You couldn't get in there. If you were a terrorist, there was no way. You might as well go after the souk next door, right? Yep. But that the rich in the world were creating global green zones, and they were becoming a new elite that lived above everything. And they were and are not only impervious to recessions, but also to climate change, because they will be able to move where the climate changes the least or to the greatest benefit. They're going to have the money and the resources to secure food, while, as you said, everyone else is going to be succumbing to this rugged individualism and forced to just kind of, fight each other for the spoils. But within that green zone, you have essentially socialism.
Right.
Where people are happy to pay their taxes and their kids are getting the best education you can imagine. And why even make it private at that point? You might as well have public education that's really excellent within those four walls.
Right.
But this is not progress. At least it's not the old liberal idea of progress. And of course, I think we should have said this at the beginning of this conversation, that by liberalism, Luce is talking about the British form of liberalism.
Right. We're not talking about common point of conservative or liberal in terms of parties.
Right. And so I just wanted to bring up something that Luce actually said in that conversation with David Frum. He said that his book is actually written for the complacent elites who live in gated communities, who live in and he called it a Versailles, like the old Versailles of royal France, the Ancien Regime of France. And that they have become complacent because they can separate themselves from it.
Absolutely.
They become complacent because the managerial democracy has worked for them. It's kept people away from the streets. It's kept people going to their jobs. And the wealthy are becoming more and more wealthy because of it. But the problem is, and what Luce says in this conversation, is that individuals don't create wealth. Society creates wealth.
Absolutely.
And individuals benefit from that. Now, I'm not saying, and certainly Luce is not saying, that a person who is smart and innovative and hardworking shouldn't be making money from it and shouldn't be getting and also isn't creating wealth, but they can only create wealth in the context of a larger society. And if a new age of divergence occurs and there are elites who are building these green zones, well, that is not only not progress, and it's not only not moral, but it's also not tenable. There's no way that could sustain itself.
Well, I would disagree with you if I'm becoming extremely cynical, but Edward Luce does say that, when you look at Western corporations, that the two fastest growing units are the legal and public relations departments, or public relations communications departments, and the highest rate of blue collar work that you can get is in the security industry.
Right. That's right.
So, and you do see it, right? Mm-hmm. You do see private companies that are growing more and more.
But is it tenable? Is it sustainable?
Well, it's tenable. I mean, over the long run, if you believe in the adage that justice trends toward the arc of history trends towards justice. Sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, slavery was 400 years, right? It's a long time, and for me, it's what's the purpose, right? And you ask the question of, are the spectrum left or right, or is it open closed? And I think that open closed spectrum works, and I think it might even go a little further than that in terms of, or to refine that really. George Lakoff wrote a book, Don't Think of an Elephant, and really talking about the morality of politics. And like we all like to do, you kind of beat up on the left and say they've become out of touch with the issues and the morality of what made them successful in the past. And his idea really stemmed around two politics of a nurturant parent sort of morality and a strict father type of morality. And the hierarchies or lack thereof that come from both of those. And so I think, when you do look at politics left and right, you see that it doesn't matter when you speak to people, and not the parties. When you speak with the folks who are telling you what their values are in their language, but may not be able to articulate them extremely well, they want our budgets to reflect our values. They want our budgets to reflect, what's important to us. And one of my favorite things to tell people is I don't think it's fair personally that billionaires and millionaires can write off caviar dinners and shrimp and sushi dinners on the backs of people that haven't gotten a raise in 2 years but have to pay taxes.
Right.
I don't think that's fair.
Right.
And it doesn't matter who I say that to. I can say that to an ardent conservative. I can say that to a super leftist, progressive. And they'd both look me in the eye and say, yeah, that's totally unfair.
Right.
Like, they can pay for it. Why does it have to be subsidized by the rest of us?
Right.
And you mentioned it, that the ratio or the amount of taxes or the burden rather of taxes, and I hate using that word burden with taxes because it's an investment in us.
Right.
That tax investment has really moved and shifted from a lot of it being on corporations, which benefit really from a lot of the work that's being done in the roads and the pipes and the healthcare and the free education and all that stuff, to the individual.
Right.
And so they pay lower taxes, and they also have, the ability to circumvent a lot of the other taxes by exploiting loopholes that, again, are subsidized by the rest of us as that tax burden shifts to the general public.
Right.
So there are a lot of assaults on the public by the elites, and I'll put government in there too.
Sure.
Just going back to what you said, because they're looking at it from identitarian politics, like managing their groups, but their ultimate group, because, money is the lifeblood of politics, are folks who have it.
Right.
So I mean, it's a circle or a squiggly line, however you want to do it, but that thread is there. And I think that as those assaults keep happening on the public, folks are going to look for something, and the old left-right mantra isn't working anymore, and we see that fraying.
I think that's key, because it's been clear now, it's been proven by many scientists that fairness, the concept of fairness, is essentially biological. It's not something we really learn or need to learn. It's not even something that can be conditioned out of us, because it's deep in our nature. Chimpanzees know what fairness is.
Right.
They didn't have to teach fairness in a book. They know what it is. They know when one chimp is getting a grape and the other chimp is getting a little cracker. Well, they know there's a difference, and they know one is getting better than the other, and they will refuse the better deal. I'm not sure if it's the cracker or the grape. They'll refuse the better deal. It's like the old prisoner's dilemma of in philosophy and political economy, that people will actually act not in their self-interest if they know that something is bad for the group. You can call it altruism, but I think it's actually a biological imperative.
Right.
I think we need to end this conversation in the same way Luce does, talking about what to do about it. And you started us off there a little bit. And there's one thing that I can't not mention, because it was so profound when I read it in this book, and I think you probably remember it, The Valley of the Clueless.
Yes.
So I'm going to quote from the book directly. I found it in here. So here it goes. Vladimir Putin is a better student of Huxley than of Orwell. When he was a KGB agent based in Dresden in the 1980s, most of its population could pick up television from the West on their transmitters. These were the most politically quiescent parts of East Germany. Far from being glued to the West German news, they were hooked on Dallas, Baywatch, and Dynasty. As Evgeny Morozov pointed out in The Net Delusion, there was one part of the East that could not receive West German TV. It was known as the Valley of the Clueless, yet it was also the most politicized part of the country. People from here applied in far higher numbers for exit visas than their supposedly better informed neighbors. Sometimes the illusion of freedom is all that people need. And what was so impactful about that, and he talks more about this later on, is that I mean, it's the age-old thing that we're distracted.
We are.
We're completely distracted from what's going on. Frankly, I don't want to listen to this podcast. I'd rather think about things that are good. This is a pretty pessimistic book.
It is.
It's pretty dark. I mean, he said, I think he believes in progress, in the Western notion of progress. He would say that hostility towards it is wrong, but it's also something that's been damaged and needs to be fought for. And no one's going to be fighting for it if they're watching. Well, I don't mean to demean anything, but if people are distracted from what's going on, then obviously we're going to lose.
Yep.
Whether or not we believe in this idea of progress or not.
See, my thing is with the book, just taking it there, it is a dark book, but it's dark because it's true. The other thing is, I'm not so sure if he settled on, at least in this book from my reading, whether he is advocating for people to fight for it.
Yeah, I got the same impression.
That it's not so much, hey, it's not a call to arms. It isn't that's not the impression I got. I got, from reading this book, that he's in a good position personally. And he has a skill set. And he has an understanding, and he's done the work of what is going on. And, hey, well, what the hell's going on, right? What on earth is going on? And he's he's made the information available. It's not his job to fan the flames of a revolution or revolt. That isn't his place. Right? And for, in all fairness, maybe it isn't. Maybe what he's offered is his piece to that battle for those who will take up, symbolic arms and fight for their community.
Yeah.
But the parallels again, like when again in the book when he speaks that Western history is usually looked at very linearly, and progress playing a part in that, and where some of the faith in progress that if we just do what we're doing, we'll eventually get to where we need to go, because
it'll all be good.
That's been the story of Western civilization. We've come out of the Dark Ages, which is kind of funny, but on the other side of the border, they weren't dark at all. Right? It was brilliant and vibrant and all that. So even the way we tell our stories, but we've told ourselves that progress happens. That and sometimes there are a few prime movers that make progress happen, and eventually we're all better off with it. Very linear view. Whereas in Eastern countries, it's very circular.
Right. Yes.
And you see that, right? You see that example even in Western, in the Western example. I mean, the Valley of the Clueless versus folks who are distracted by the show or the app or the or the video du jour.
They're keeping up with the Kardashians.
Or keeping up, but it's us, and it really does take me back to what I said before, from the book, where the two largest, you want to find a job, become a lawyer, get into communications and public relations.
Yeah.
I can't help but to think of things and people like Edward Bernays, who wrote the book Propaganda, I think was like the nephew or the great nephew of Sigmund Freud, right? It's psychology, and they understand it.
Yeah.
And those who have money, there is an assault on the public for profit.
Yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like it's this, there's arch nemesis who, we hate the dirty masses or anything like that. But there is clearly an assault, and we are all too okay with being assaulted. Right? Because we are distracted. We don't have these conversations about values and looking at, what's wrong and, how do we fix it?
Eric, this has been a terrific conversation.
I've enjoyed myself very much.
Thanks so much for coming on and doing this with me, and I really honestly hope we do it again.
Thanks.
Cool.
Enjoy it.
All right, your quote of the week is from H.L. Mencken, the early 20th century American writer. Here goes. For every subtle and complicated question, there is a perfectly simple and straightforward answer, which is wrong. Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.